IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I am Aditya Pareek. Guerra de cosa, or economic warfare, is often identified as a tool of coercion in international relations. The United States and certain members of the EU have sought to alter Russia's actions through economic pressure. This includes elaborate sanctions regime under CAATSA, countering America's adversaries through Sanctions Act, and other measures. Now, there is again talk of cutting Russia off from SWIFT, which is the primary electronic fund transfer mechanism for the international banking system. Some in IR academia circles see this as a proverbial financial iron curtain descending. To throw more light on the issue, I have with me today Anupam Manur. Welcome, Anupam.
Hey, thanks. Good to be here.
Anupam is one of the subject matter experts we have in the field of economics and international finances. He's an assistant professor here at Takshashila's Policy School. He's also assistant editor of the Indian Public Policy Review IPPR journal. To start with, Anupam, for the benefit of our listeners, could you tell us what is SWIFT and how is it central to the global financial and banking system?
Hey, so SWIFT, let's first start with this, right? SWIFT is an acronym and it stands for Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. So I have a flippant answer and I have a serious answer. Let's start with the flippant one. SWIFT is essentially a glorified SMS system for banks. Okay, so SWIFT is a messaging service. And what it does is it provides a network that enables financial institutions worldwide to send and receive information about financial transactions. So it does this in a secure, standardized, and reliable environment. Right? So these are largely the words that they use to describe their own, their own service. But essentially, SWIFT is not something that enables funds transfer. Rather, it does not, undertake the funds transfer itself, but it sends and receives, payment orders between banks. Now, historically, if any of our listeners are as old as I am or older, basically the world was using something called a telex, which is an ancient system for such messages. And these messages were largely, there were descriptions sent by one person who had to write it down and then send it to another. Of course, human errors crept in. It was easy to hack. There was a lot of things that could go wrong. So SWIFT is slightly more sophisticated, not slightly, probably a lot more sophisticated system for sending and receiving these payment orders between banks, right? And then once that message is sent and it's, both agree upon the message, then the actual payment takes place between these things. So there's a settling account and there's various clearing houses, etc., that does the settlement between the banks. So that's what SWIFT is.
Interesting. So SWIFT is more of a facilitator than the actual carrier of the transactions.
Yeah, that's true. So it facilitates this, and it's a crucial aspect of the entire financial system. Now, you might, again, it's not belittling to say it is just a messaging service, because the messaging service is what is at the heart of all forms of international transactions that take place, right? So firstly, what goes into this messaging service? It's you need to figure out who is sending it, to whom, for what purpose, how much, and how do you process it? Is there an intermediary? So all of this information has to be transferred from one bank to another. And to do so in a reliable manner, such that you know exactly that this is coming from the person that it claims to be coming from. If not, that's where fraud happens. So you need it to be reliable. You also need it to have standardization. So for example, each of these messages go into a very particular code, SWIFT code, right? And so you just have to read that code to figure out what happens where. So it's all standardized, the messages, and it relies very minimally on kind of human interaction, which is why also it enables this kind of security between the different banks that are transacting. To give you a kind of an estimate of the scale, right? About rule of the thumb or a back of the hand envelope tells me that about half of financial transactions, big inter-country financial transactions takes place through SWIFT, right? It has about 11,000 financial institutions which have subscribed to this SWIFT in 200 odd countries. And again, to give you an idea, in March 2021, from March 2020 to March 2021, it recorded an average of about 42.5 million messages per day on an average. So that gives you an idea of its scale and its centrality to the entire global financial services.
Indeed. So even if it has a lot of features which make it quite central to our global financial system, but that still leaves the space that it's not really irreplaceable. There could be alternatives. So this proves to be a good segue to our next question, I think. So the West has been a bit worried about Russian gray zone activities, and on the other side, Russia has been quite irked by gray zone activities and war by other means from the West. So Russia has been contemplating its own domestic alternative to the SWIFT system. For example, SPFS, System for Transfer of Financial Messages. Would such an approach work for Russia? And I think Russia's chairman of the State Duma Committee on Financial Markets, Anatoly, he recently said that if Russia is cut off from SWIFT, the impact will be devastating, but they have confidence that since SWIFT is so widely adopted, that is the only advantage it has over SPFS, as far as I understand. Correct me if I'm wrong. So they have confidence that once they are cut off, if they are cut off rather, the partners that have not joined SPFS as of now would immediately do so, and that would make their participation in SWIFT redundant.
So that's being optimistic, to say the least. It doesn't quite work this way, right? So you have essentially this idea of network effects come into play when you're talking about a global messaging service. So the more people who are naturally onboarded onto such a messaging service, the more value there is for everyone, right? So the decision to whether become a member of such a service will be largely dependent on how many people are already on part of this, right? Which is why you see, SWIFT is not the only such messaging service in existence. Forget about the Russian-led one, but there are others as well. There's Fedwire, for example. There's something called Ripple. There's something called CHIPS, which is clearinghouse interbank payment system. So there are others, but all of them are minute because again, if a bank can be member of only one such messaging service, that need not be true, but let's assume for the moment that it is, then you have a choice between one where 11,000 other banks are there or one where, let's say, 50 banks are there. Which one would you choose? Right? Naturally, the one with 11,000, and therefore that will become 11,001. And then the next bank will also have to make a choice, and therefore it becomes 11,002, and so on and so forth. So essentially, that's what it comes down to. SWIFT has the network, and that is crucial for it to work, and therefore more and more banks will join it. Now, let's look at the conditions for which this alternative system, SPFS by Russia, whether it'll work or not, slightly later into the podcast. But for now, just understand that network effects form an extremely important aspect, and SPFS doesn't have it right now.
All right. So since we're on the subject of Russia, so economic sanctions by the United States after the 2014 seizure of Crimea was something that Russia is finding very hard to bear. And it would be, in retrospect, kind of fair to say that their economic fortunes kind of shrunk overnight because of those sanctions. So, but people think that politically, those sanctions have not really had the same impact on Russia that the West hoped for, even if they've inflicted some pain. So will this prospect of Russia being cut off from SWIFT be the proverbial last straw that breaks the camel's back, in your opinion?
That's an interesting question and an interesting take as well. So there's obviously multiple layers here that requires unraveling. Maybe we don't have enough time for to do this because it probably requires an entire episode of its own. But let's very briefly look at what did the sanctions actually achieve in Russia. And so we know, for example, that the sanctions were were imposed in 2014. And since then, just look at one metric, for example, which would be Russia's GDP growth. Russia has grown on an average at about 0.3% per year. And I'm taking only up till 2019 because then the pandemic hits and the entire world goes into an entirely different state. So up till 2019, Russia grew at about 0.3% per year. The global average at the same time was 2.3% per year. Right? So that tells you that Russia has fallen behind, and it was not so before the sanctions. Right? Look at, for example, one estimate would say that the sanctions have imposed a cost of about 3% GDP growth per year for these 5 years, right? So it had to be about, let's say, between 2.8 and 3.3%, and instead it is only at 0.3% per year. So it's lower by that much. This roughly translates to about $50 billion per year. Right, which is in no terms small, and you could take multiple different reasons for it. Essentially, and where the sanctions actually play is that banks in Russia, companies in Russia, do not have access to foreign capitals, right? And because it's a financial sanction mainly. So that obviously had a major impact on Russia. The second channel through which all of this plays out is the foreign direct investment, right? So because you don't have foreign direct investment coming into Russia, essentially, since US has threatened any banks that deal with Russian companies, and indirectly also any bank that deals with a company that has set up in Russia. Obviously, companies, foreign companies are loath to going and setting up let's say a factory or any kind of business unit within Russia. So all of this together has had really significant impact on the Russian economy. Right now, having said that, we have to realize that the economic sanctions were levied for a geopolitical purpose. And you have to look at, ultimately what kind of effect that has had in that geopolitical realm. So its effect on the economic realm is quite clear. As I said, it is quite devastating. And I'm using a strong word very deliberately here. But in the geopolitical realm, maybe it has had some deterrent effect on further offensive action in Ukraine. Maybe not. I mean, in fact, you're the expert on that case. Has it tied back Russia? I don't know. But that's for, that kind of geopolitical effect has to be realized. But that is where I think most experts would tend to agree. Probably it's not as much as one would have hoped, because Russia still continues to occupy Crimea in various ways. And therefore, it's not really dialed back, which was the hope. And that's I think the assessment. So you could, and that's where SWIFT, you have to look at SWIFT in that angle as well. So SWIFT will further significantly damage the Russian economy in terms of the economic impact. But will it have a geopolitical effect? I'm not sure, because you could still have a Putin who says, we'll make Russia immune to these in whatever, as in we'll absorb as much of the economic pain, but we won't dial back our action. So in that sense, you have an entirely different equation there.
Agreed. And in international relations, it's not just about the game of power and dialing back geopolitical actions or not. It's also about cooperation in other spheres. For example, we might think that it might not hurt us sitting here. But for example, I was thinking from a very selfish perspective, I wish to study in Russia. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of students who study medicine go to CIS countries and Russia to study medicine. So what's going to happen to their prospects of paying their fees? So that fallout is going to reach us as well.
Oh, definitely. I mean, there will be multiple such fallouts in the entire international realm. In fact, don't rule this out, that a lot of the US and EU companies itself will get affected. So any of those companies which were trading with Russia, and they're not small by any means, all of them do get affected by this, because now, let's say they were importing something from Russia, and they were doing that because Russia offered, let's say, the best product at the lowest price. So now you're imposing a cost to even those companies, which have to look around for an alternative or a substitute for those products that will add to their transaction cost. So just remember, no sanctions or a barrier to trade is without cost to all parties involved. Right? It does have significant cost to all parties involved. It's just that, probably the host country which is which is imposing these sanctions will bear a slightly lower cost than the target country. And in the US case, it is true. For many other countries, they cannot pull it off because it will always be the other way around. That is, you face far more probably damage to yourself than what you can impose on the other country. So that dynamic does play, and that's only because the US is the biggest economy in the world. Any other country trying to imitate this would have terribly failed by now.
Yeah, and I think this concept that, although I don't understand the depth of the statement itself, the concept itself, but I'd still like to bring this up that people say that you can't just unseat the US dollar as the reserve currency of the world. And I think yesterday it was revealed that Russia's Ministry of Finance has disinvested from the dollar completely. They're not holding any of their assets in dollar. And I remember it was 5% yen, 40% euro, 30% yuan, 20% gold, and 5% British pounds. So this sort of disinvestment from dollar, where do you see this going?
Well, the death of the dollar has been, exaggerated multiple times. And first, international community said that yen would probably replace the dollar as a reserve currency. China has been trying its hand at that and at this particular task for a very long time. There have been, EU itself, for example, has essentially thought of euro replacing the dollar as the world's reserve currency. So there have been multiple attempts at that, and for whatever reason, none of that has worked. And I don't see the dollar being dethroned in any way in the foreseeable future, right? It remains the most important kind of currency for the world because all forms of trade takes place. So if India is trading with Nepal, we don't do it in Indian rupees, but we do it in US dollars. Similarly, take any two countries, neighboring countries, which probably share a lot more than what they would ever share with the US, but the currency for transaction remains the US dollar, right? So in that sense, the US dollar is the most sought after currency. It's something that gives maximum value to all the people who hold it, which is why the rest of the world hold dollars. And in fact, we kind of subsidize US debt. That's a separate topic altogether, but I'm just telling you about the importance of the US dollar, right? Now, what would happen if Russia is cut off from this, which has been happening for the last 5 years? We kind of spoke about what has happened, right, in terms of its effects on Russian economy, from foregoing international credit, again, to the tune of something like 479 billion or so, to lost or foregone FDI, because again, dollar is the currency through which foreign direct investment happens. And so all of this together is massive. And so I don't see the US dollar being replaced in any way in the foreseeable future.
Interesting. So let me bring up the elephant in the room now. So we live in a world where not only governments and their legal tender currencies, but blockchains and cryptocurrencies also affect the world economy. Could you give us a perspective on what would it mean for the Russian government to introduce a digital ruble, or say India to introduce a digital rupee that's been talked about?
I'm extremely skeptical about it. Essentially, this is one of those things, right? A digital currency is something that the central banks around the world have suddenly discovered that they can do. So they've discovered a tool, but they have no clue whatsoever about how to use that tool, and more importantly, whether that tool is even useful and in what sense, right? So I think this is an extremely confused space for a lot of people, including central banks, because I remember even the RBI put out this little announcement saying we'll introduce a digital rupee, we're looking into it and so on. But it has no meaning. Because of two things. Let me take us down that route. One, a digital currency, right? Whether it's a digital ruble or a digital rupee, the value will be derived from the same source, which is basically that it is fiat money, right? So the value of it comes because the government says it has value. That's about it. And of course, then the monetary policy kicks in. The value comes from how much of that currency is already in circulation, right? But essentially, it means that it's exactly the same as the analog version of the currency. So it doesn't, drastically change things. Now, why are digital currencies, apart from, your centralized currencies, your blockchain and so on, has the added advantage that at least it is decentralized, So your digital currency is not decentralized; it's still done by the RBI, so it loses out on that. Secondly, it means your currency is based on blockchain technology, or it's more secure. It also means it's anonymous for a large number of people. Your government can't track you. All of those advantages don't lie with whether it's a digital ruble or a digital rupee. So why would people want to hold it? Hey, it might help in ease of some transactions for sure. I could pay someone using digital rupee instead of whatever physical rupee, but the difference between the two is minimal, right? And it only means it's advantages for the government because they'll have far greater control over where that money is going. That basically the way the money travels. So it's absolutely advantageous for the government, but not at all for anyone who's using it. So I would any day hold on to 500 rupee note, then have 500 rupees in digital form, because that 500 rupee note, I can spend it without the government knowing what I'm spending it on. So all of those aspects come into play. So I don't see that as a panacea. In any sense, it's not going to change anything. People will not drastically start using a digital ruble across the world, right? Because ultimately, the demand for that currency has to come by the people who use it, and that demand is done by how many people. That demand comes from the fact that how many other people are willing to use it, right? So again, why would let's say you and I want to hold digital ruble? We won't. Even if you're trading with some other country, even in fact we're trading with Russia, I'd rather deal with dollars, because again, that dollar is fungible. I can use it across the world. I can do many other things with the dollar than I can do with a digital ruble. So I think that's an exaggerated statement done by Russian ministers or whatever authorities, that they can create this digital currency and that will replace the dollar in some sense. I absolutely will push back against that. It's not true at all.
Yeah, in some sense, union governments and federal governments, be it India's or be it Russia's, they find the concept of a ledger which is not under their control, controlling the finances of their economy, quite irksome. A situation that they'd rather not have. So that's why they've been quite averse to the idea of letting decentralized currencies run the world. So this, but those governments aren't the only people, only entities who are running the world of finance in general. So you briefly mentioned clearinghouses in one of the answers previously. So what about those, such as MasterCard and Visa? How would this affect them? So according to a recent commentary by a Russia expert that I follow, Dr. Maria Shakina, she says that the EU also wants to reduce its reliance on US entities like these, MasterCard and Visa. So I think we also have our own RuPay. Could you put this in a more accessible perspective for our listeners?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting phenomena that in many senses you had a duopoly of sorts in the world in terms of payment clearing houses, and that was largely done by Visa and MasterCard around the world. So this is for payments between different individuals and mainly your point of sale. Now, you can have domestic alternatives to that, similarly as you have other messaging service as well. So SPFS, for example, it's not that it won't work. It will, and in all probability will work, but it is only limited to within Russia, right? So similarly, any other clearing house which can rival MasterCard and Visa can work, but it will be necessarily regional in nature. So for India, for instance, if I would use a Visa and go to a shop and use Visa, that had to go all the way across the world, get processed there, come back, and basically they would do the clearing between me and my account and the shopkeeper's account. Now you could have that in a regional scale. So RuPay does that, with its whatever offices or clearing houses within India itself. So transaction costs are greatly reduced, and you could have some form of other benefits to this as well. That is, you're basically hedging your payment systems. You're not having your entire payment system being located in another country, which can have security risks. So for all of those purposes, I am all for having multiple clearing houses. And in fact, it'll also act as a necessarily competition to MasterCard and Visa, which means that down the the line, you can have reduced merchant fees. So for all of those purposes, it's great. Having a rupee in India, for instance. Similarly, you can, and people have choice. Now, you can choose to have a rupee for one set of purposes and choose to have something else for Visa and MasterCard for another set of purposes, right? So similarly, within Russia as well, they can have a clearinghouse set up for all forms of settlement within Russia. But the question is, how valid will that be when you get out of Russian borders? And there again, the answer is that it won't be extremely useful. So you could have, Russia could set up a network within its allies where it's accepted and so on. But it's the same thing. You can't take a rupee and, let's say, try to use it in a pub in the UK. Right. Similarly, there will be restrictions with what Russia can do with its own clearinghouse.
So to summarize, can you give our listeners a quick jog through some more ideas about what exact impacts would Russia being out of SWIFT or would mean for the world?
Yeah, so we spoke about the kind of impact of various sanctions on Russia and further what will happen when you essentially de-SWIFT Russia, if I could use that word. You just have to think about, go back to what Russian Finance Minister Alexei Kudrin said in 2014 when this issue came up first. He had forecast that de-SWIFTing Russia could cause Russia's GDP to shrink by as much as 5%. So that gives you an idea. And this is coming from, the Russia's finance minister himself back in the day. That number could have slightly changed now. Some part of it could be mitigated perhaps by the Russia's own payment systems, right, the SPFS, but not by too much, as we have discussed throughout the podcast. What would happen, just another idea to take from this would be as to what happened with Iran, for example, when they were disconnected from SWIFT. Iran, when they were de-SWIFTed, lost almost half of its oil export revenues, right, and about 30% of its foreign trade. Now, you could expect some form of similar numbers, at least in that ballpark, in terms of effects for Russia, right? Basically, Russia's export in the hydrocarbons, which is largely denominated in US dollars, will take a massive hit. That could have implications in terms of if Russia's exports of hydrocarbons will get hit, then Russia's economy will get hit. But also all those countries which are importing oil and other products from Russia will also get hit. So there will be economic repercussions for the rest of the world. And this will also set, remember, a dangerous precedent. So when you de-SWIFted, and SWIFT, remember, is a private company, it's located in Belgium, there's a whole bunch of other things, right? Now US is taking the lead on this. It also set a dangerous precedent. Now what if, when it happened to Iran, people didn't take too much notice. Iran is a small country with a small economy, but Russia is an entirely different story. If something like this is successful versus Russia, then it can set a precedent which other countries will then look out for, and the power of the US in purely in that financial world will probably get even bigger, right? So that's, I think, one of the big impacts in the world. So there will be immediately, as I said, there will be currency volatility, capital outflows out of Russia, companies which deal with Russia will get hit and so on. But in the long run, the fact that this can be done to a country as big as Russia means it can probably be done to other countries as well. So that's something to look out for.
All right. And on that note, to folks, we'll wrap it up. And to our listeners, if you like today's discussion, please feel free to check out all our past and future episodes of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Ciet and Cred. We really appreciate the support. It is what makes this possible. So it was a fun week on Cyrus Says. We had guests like Dolly Singh, we had Guneet Monga, we had Kamya Jani of Curry Tales, and Cock and Bull as we always did. Do check it out. I think you'll really enjoy that. On Paisa Vaisa, we crossed 300 episodes and Anupam was joined by Akhil Handa, the digital head of Bank of Baroda. All Things Policy discussed topics like the 100 years of China's Communist Party, the Facebook versus the Government of India case, and the evolution of Indian science. On the Wire Talk, Siddharth Bhatia was joined by Gautam Bhatia to discuss the Central Vista project and why it's attracting so much flack. Sadaf and Archit are back on the Non-Curry podcast, and this time they raise the temperatures as they discuss the beloved spice mirchi. On the Millennial Athlete, this week Tanvi and Shlok speak to Sarita Chauri, a visually impaired judoist. And finally, I want to ask you all to give a listen to the Triangle Offense. Anybody who has heard me talk on a podcast knows I can't shut up about basketball, and these guys know more about it than I do. So if you enjoy basketball, do check this out. Nishant and Monish do an excellent job with this show. I was one of their guests a few months ago, which is how I met them and tried to convince them to come onto the network, and they're finally here. So definitely do check this out. Show's available on all major podcasting platforms, but they also have a daily YouTube episode, which is available on the IVM Podcast channel. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Do you know Tamil? Tamil puriyuma? Do your children enjoy great stories that inculcate good values? Hi, I am Ravishankar Balachandran and I host the Storytime Tamil podcast. I am excited to share a short story with great moral values every day. Listen to Storytime Tamil on the IVM podcast app, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts from.